समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Donald Trump's radical strategic shift has set the cat among the European pigeons. Now, from among that flock of scared pigeons, a hawk is trying to rise. And that hawk, predictably, is France, because there is always a French exception. In fact, it's the French who've always believed that just as the Americans think, sometimes they debate that there is an American exception. The French have no debate about that. The French do believe strongly that there is a French exception. That French exception now has been expressed by Emmanuel Macron, the president. He made an address, it's a broadcast, where he said, and mark his words, I'm using the translation provided officially by the French government. He said France is willing to discuss extending the protection afforded by its nuclear arsenal to its European allies. Immediately after that, the European allies, 27 European countries, and they also included Zelensky to attend that meeting in Brussels to discuss some of these ideas, because this has been a concern in Europe for some time, and this was also triggered in some ways by what Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, most likely of Germany, had said just the other day in February, that Europe has now to basically think of fending for itself, and it cannot always count on the possibility or the inevitability of the Americans rising to its defense in case they are threatened by Russia big time. Because from every indication so far, it looks like Trump doesn't just want to abandon Ukraine, but he is pushing Ukraine into some kind of a settlement that Putin might prefer. So he is pushing Ukraine into settling with Russia on Putin's terms. And that is something that has alarmed the Europeans. Now that's where Europeans feel really weak, because one, Trump is right and Trumpians are right, that Europeans have not invested in their defense for a very long time. And that's the reason the Europeans have now come up with a plan. Ursula von der Leyen laid out the plan, saying that they are going to invest 800 billion euros. Currencies fluctuate, but a euro is about the same as the dollar. 800 billion euros on their defense. I mean, to put this figure in perspective, this is more than 10 times of India's defense budget for this year. That's what the Europeans say they will spend in addition to what they already spent on their defense. 650 billion euros will be spent by European countries as nations, and 150 billion will be put into one common fund to be used by them. Now, while all of that happens, that will take time. And if this abandonment by America carries on, then the Europeans will feel really insecure, because all this while, the European security, the reason they felt so pampered and so safe and saw no need to invest in their armed forces. In fact, most of the European countries will struggle to even put up 3 regiments or 4 regiments of tanks, or even in some cases 2 regiments of tanks in a battle. As we speak right now, outside of Russia, if you consider Russia a purely European country, although a large part of Russia is actually Asian, it's in Asia, but outside of Russia, the strongest European army, in fact, is the Ukrainian army right now. Now, one, it gives you an idea of how much has been invested in building Ukrainian army where none existed, but it also tells you how much European countries have ignored their armed forces, because the Germans, in any case, following the Second World War, they were more or less forbidden from building armed forces of their own, and they were told, look, you don't need to do that. Last time you tried to do that, last 100 years, you tried to look after your own security. That did not end so well. quite often and ultimately leading to your annihilation. So leave it to us. We look after it. That was the message from the Americans. That message now seems like it's being withdrawn, at least in the Trump era. And that's why this sense of urgency that all this while we thought we didn't have to spend on defense, we could spend on our social welfare, free bus rides, free this, free that, late retirement, 30 hour, 32 hour, 36 hour working weeks, etc., etc. Now that equation is changing. Now that is where while Friedrich Merz raised this concern in February, because he read the writing on the wall after Trump's initial statements and actions, and Ursula von der Leyen has talked about putting up this 800 billion euros and collecting this money. Macron has spoken out. And it does look like, in one of the earlier episodes of Cut the Clutter, I had said, now it looks like that Trump is saying that there are three big guys in the world. That is America, he himself, Xi Jinping, and Putin. Because one, he likes strong men. And second, he likes countries which have a huge land mass. He's impressed with size. That's the reason he also wants Greenland, Panama Canal, and God knows what else tomorrow, and Gaza Strip. So he also sees power in size. And I had then said that this will create a new challenge for swing states, intermediary powers, or swing states. And I had mentioned two of these. One is India, of course, and second was France. So one of those states has now risen to basically say that we are not just a swing state, or if we are a swing state, we are a critical swing state at a time when one of these three big guys is abandoning the rest of my friends and neighbors. So Macron has spoken out essentially to make that point. I will quote a few more lines from what he said in this speech, and then I will also share with you some of the things he had said in 2020, but looks like nobody paid much attention to him 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine took place. So maybe people checked back on that speech and they've been thinking about it. But as long as Biden was there, they would have thought, okay, that had some relevance, but does not cause such a sense of urgency. But now they will go back to it and read it very carefully, which is what I have done also. So from his latest statement or the latest speech, where he said that his nuclear weapons could be used as a deterrent for the defense of his European allies, he goes on to say, and I quote, "Our nuclear deterrence protects us. It is comprehensive, sovereign, and French through and through." And then he says, since 1964, our nuclear deterrence has played an explicit role in preserving peace and security of Europe. And then says, I have decided, I'm quoting from his speech, I have decided to open the strategic debate on protection through deterrence for allies on the European continent. Russia has become a threat to Europe and France for years to come. So this is history repeating itself, except now it has leapfrog backwards. So earlier Germany used to be the threat in the subcontinent, but now it has leapfrog backwards, maybe to the Tsarist era, where Russia has become a threat. And he says, I want to believe that the US will remain by our side, but we need to be ready if that is no longer the case. The future of Europe should not be decided in Washington or Moscow. Now, what was it triggered by? I told you just a minute back that this was triggered by something that Friedrich Merz, the most likely German chancellor in the new coalition that will be formed after the last election. Germany must always have a coalition. That's the way the constitution and the electoral system is structured. He said in February, and I quote from him, "We must brace ourselves for the fact that Donald Trump will no longer unconditionally honor NATO's mutual defense commitment." Now, the NATO treaty has clause 5. The clause 5 is the critical one. Clause 5 essentially says that if any of the NATO members is attacked by another state, then it will be seen like an attack on all of NATO. So every NATO member will then rise to its defense with a full commitment. That is what he says he's not sure of anymore, and that's the reason we Europeans have to think, how does that Article 5 of NATO treaty or convention work? Let me explain to you with an Indian example, or an example where India got caught in this. This was 1950s. 1950s, after India became independent, Goa was still under Portuguese occupation. Why did the Portuguese not leave? And why did Nehru not immediately send his forces, Indian army, to evict the Portuguese? Because they were not there in a very large, strong military strength. They could have been evicted quite easily. That is because Portugal was a member of NATO. Portugal was also clever or shrewd to say that this was not a colony. They said Goa is part of our territory. Goa is not a colony. And because of that, because they said this is not a colony, this is our territory, any other powers, military intervention in Goa would compulsorily bring in NATO's intervention. So did India really want to mess with NATO at that point? So it took some time, a lot of diplomatic activity to persuade the world that Goa was not part of Portuguese territory, that it was a colony. Once India was reasonably convinced of that, Army, Navy, Air Force were sent out. The Goa operation was over very quickly. In any case, there was a freedom movement on there, which was quite strong already. That tells us, I use that example to tell us the meaning of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Then Merz said, and I quote again, that we have to talk to the British and the French whether their nuclear protection could also be extended to us. It's an issue that French government has repeatedly raised with our government. Now I take you back to what Macron said in 2020, and nobody paid too much attention to that. I'm sure some people might have said, or there might have been some snarky comments. Look at this Macron, look at the French. They're trying to be leaders of the free world. We are all right. We have an arrangement that's gone on since 1945. What is he talking about? The French always talk like that. Why? Because the French will be the French. So Macron said he was speaking at the French Military Academy, École de Guerre. That means the school of war. Guerre means war in French. And I quote from that speech. He said the Europeans and ourselves cannot ignore these broad trends at a time when other powers are engaged in rearmament programs, including nuclear rearmament, and when over the past years we have seen an acceleration of these programs. He said the usual Cold War measures or Cold War arrangements that we got used to, those are now shaky. You can't rely on them anymore. And I again quote from him. Then he says that unlike France and its allies, some states are consciously or deliberately opting for opaque and aggressive nuclear postures, which include a dimension of blackmailing and a fait accompli, right? Ya mujhko de do or I will come and nuke you. And then he appealed to the European mind by saying turning back into a field of confrontation for non-European nuclear powers would not be acceptable. I won't accept it. When he said non-European nuclear powers, who was he referring to? Obviously, he could be referring to China because Russia is European. When he said non-European, you could say China, but the other non-European nuclear power he was referring to is not Pakistan. It's not India. It was obviously the US. So that is always, that is the French skepticism that's always existed about the American intentions. In fact, I will share with you a story by Yaroslav Trofimov in the Wall Street Journal, who recounts a conversation between John F. Kennedy and his French counterpart, General de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, in Paris in the course of the Berlin crisis of 1961, where General de Gaulle asks Kennedy, he asks, these are declassified conversations, so they are available on record. So he asks Kennedy that, look, if the Russians really come marching in, if they assault Central Europe, will you risk losing New York to protect your European partners? Kennedy said to him, General, you have worked with the Americans, you have fought with the Americans. If even you are skeptical about this, if even you can have doubts about this, maybe Khrushchev can also have doubts about this. So these doubts always existed. I will quote for you a line from Trofimov's article. And he says, the existential dilemma of extended deterrence, which is, would a nuclear power risk the annihilation of its own homeland to defend a faraway ally? That is the worry now that the Europeans have in the Trump era. Again, going back to Macron's 2020 speech. He says, and I quote, "Our nuclear forces have a deterrent effect in themselves, particularly in Europe. They strengthen the security of Europe through their very existence, and they have, in this sense, a truly European dimension." He then invites other European countries to exercise with his nuclear forces, and again goes on to say, I would like to start a dialogue with our European partners which are ready for it on the role played by French nuclear deterrence in our collective security." Now let's come back to the basics. What is the Transatlantic Alliance and what is the nuclear dimension in the Transatlantic Alliance? Transatlantic Alliance is basically Europe, which also includes Turkey, by the way. Americans still have a bunch of nuclear bombs stored in Turkey, I think in the Incirlik Air Base and underground vaults. An alliance between these nations, European nations, Turkey in this case describes itself as European, although a very small part of Turkey falls in Europe, and America across the Atlantic. That is the Transatlantic Alliance. Transatlantic Alliance has three nuclear weapon powers. One is the US, the daddy of daddies, of course. Then there is France, and then there is Britain. France and Britain have actually been collaborating quite actively on the nuclear weapons because they've seen their own nuclear weapons as a kind of joint deterrent, not just for each other, but also for Europe. So they've also set up a program or a facility where they help each other test their weapons. I'm sure they exchange notes on strategic doctrines, etc. That program or that facility is called EPURE, E-P-U-R-E. Besides that, while only 3 countries have nuclear weapons, all the other NATO countries are part of a program that we might call nuclear sharing. What happens there is that while nuclear weapons are with a few countries, mostly, predominantly by the Americans, all the others aid that effort. So there are many fighter aircraft which are dual capable aircraft, right? So they can carry conventional weapons, they can be used for protection of your own aircraft, your own territory, air-to-air warfare, but they can also carry nuclear weapons. Those are dual capable aircraft. If you see in India, then I would say Mirage 2000, Jaguars, Sukhoi 30 MKIs, Rafale. These are all nuclear capable aircraft or dual capable aircraft. So 7 NATO members maintain dual capable aircraft. That means they also practice and rehearse using nuclear weapons, which means in case a nuclear exchange happens, these aircraft and pilots are trained and available to be involved in nuclear warfare. Within these NATO countries, there are 5 to 6 bases. 5 to 6 because sometimes some bases from the past have been abandoned or have been given up. 6 of these countries, European countries, NATO countries in Europe, also play a supportive role. What is the supporting role? The supportive role is that in case there is a nuclear exchange and you have nuclear armed aircraft going out or missiles being fired, then you will use your own resources to protect your aircraft, to protect your nuclear missiles, etc. So they play a supporting role. It's a very elaborate system there. In fact, there is a name for this system, this supportive system, that's called the SNOWCAT mission. What's the SNOWCAT mission? What does SNOWCAT stand for? This is support for nuclear operations with conventional air tactics, which means if you have 6 aircraft from such and such country carrying nuclear weapons, right? Then there will be 16 others up in the air to protect these 6 aircraft. That is part of the SNOWCAT mission that other NATO members carry out. So it's a very elaborate system. However, while it was trusted all this while, the trust has begun to break. One, it began to break because Russia launched itself into a massive nuclear expansion. They came up with the new missiles, new hypersonic missiles, which were pushing at the boundaries of the treaties they had in the past on strategic arms reduction with the Americans. And everybody thought that the Russians, that Putin now had different intentions. Then, once the war in Ukraine started, Putin has held out a nuclear threat many times. That if you're sitting in America, you might say, all right, Putin bluffs, we'll call his bluff. But if you're living in Europe, right, the idea that Putin could use even a tactical nuclear weapon on European soil is very scary. And that's what got the Europeans really worried. And now this threat of abandonment by the Americans, first of all, has made Europe wake up. And second, it's given the French the reason to say, see, you guys should have been listening to us earlier. Always be skeptical of the Americans. Always keep your own stuff ready. Don't just leave everything to American guarantees. In fact, that is the reason why the French got their nuclear weapons in the first place, because the French were sort of allies, but it was during the 1956 Suez crisis. Now, I can't go down that rabbit hole and talk for 5 minutes about the 1956 Suez crisis, but that is when Britain, France, and Israel together invaded Egypt to take control of the Suez Canal. And Egypt had just nationalized, Nasser had nationalized Suez Canal. Otherwise, it was owned by a multinational company. In that war, instead of siding with its allies, France and UK, the US took an opposing position along with the Soviet Union. Not very different from what happened just the other day, just over a week back, when at a UN General Assembly vote, the US voted alongside Russia on a Ukraine resolution. And this was a resolution on which even China and India abstained. But America voted alongside Russia. So this is not very different from what happened in the Suez crisis in 1956. And when that happened, the French made a decision in principle to go for nukes of their own, to not just depend on American guarantees. 1960, they tested their first nuke and they built up their arsenal after that. And now they have a considerable, credible arsenal. And as these debates went on, 2012, that is much before, 10 years before the war in Ukraine broke out, 2012, there was a deterrence and defense posture review by NATO, which said, and I quote from the document, the supreme guarantee of the security of the allies is provided by the strategic nuclear forces of the allies, especially the US and independent nuclear forces of United Kingdom and France, which have a deterrent role of their own. They contribute to the overall deterrence and security of the allies. That is the dimension that is now coming out in the open. Now, once again, because cut the clutter is about understanding intricacies, right? One intricacy here is, as I told you earlier, Americans keep debating whether there is an American exception. The French are 100% that there is a French exception and they live it. So all of NATO's nuclear decision-making, doctrine, etc., is all, the power over that is exercised by the nuclear planning group of NATO. France, member of NATO, but is out of the nuclear planning group. Why? Because the French must have total autonomy over their nuclear weapons. And the authority on that use lies only with the President of France. Even now, when Macron has made this offer of French nuclear deterrence for Europe, he said the authority of the use of these weapons shall only vest with the President of France. Now, finally, the question that I'm sure many of you will be thinking about, who has how many nukes, right? How many nukes does France have? Should Russia worry about France's nukes? The fact is that the number of nukes doesn't matter so much. The late Dr. K. Subramaniam, the father of our foreign minister now, S. Jaishankar, he used to say, and so many of us have learned the basics of strategic studies, strategic issues from him. We are so fortunate. He used to say that on the nuclear issue, that more is not needed when less is enough, right? Immortal line that he spoke. However, since everybody likes the numbers, I will show you a chart. Please see the chart on your screens, and numbers will tell you that Russia has the highest number of warheads in the world right now, 5,580. US has 5225. Both of these can build many more if they wish to in very short time. Russia 5,580, US 5,225. Then comes China, a distant third at 600. Then France at 290, UK at 225, India at 172, Pak at 170, Israel with 90, and North Korea at 50. But once again, as I told you, nuclear weapons today are almost never to be used. Just the threat, just the fact that you have them and the doctrine to use them in some situation. For example, in the Indian doctrine, if India is hit by any weapon of mass destruction of any kind, any size, then Indian doctrine says the response will be vastly and disproportionately high to annihilate the aggressor who's used such a weapon. So similarly, deterrence, the key to deterrence lies in the adversary believing that that you have a deterrence available to you, and second, that you have the willingness and the courage to use it when time arises.